Hi everyone, it's me again. Welcome back to e-learning. So we're still on history grade 7 and the topic is the Dutch settlement. So we're going to focus on the reasons why the Dutch East India Company settled at the Cape, the results of them settling there, why slaves were brought to the Cape, where the slaves came from, how slaves were brought to the Cape, what was it like to be a slave, and lastly, the cause and effects of slave resistance at the Cape. So let's start with the reasons why they permanently settled at the Cape. Now, the symbol for VOC is at the top on the right between the two flags. Now, if you look at the map here, you could see that in Europe, long ago, you learned in grade 6, okay, that wasn't so long ago, but in the European traders in 1498, that is long ago, Vasco da Gama, he decided that he wanted to travel across the ocean to trade with the East. He did not want to use to trade with them across the Sahara Desert. So he set sail and he started a trade route. And in 1500s, the other European countries like Netherlands, Britain, Spain, and France, they also decided they wanted part of this lucrative trade, and they wanted to spice their food up by getting all the delicious spices from the East. So they set sail in their boats, and in 1602, the Dutch East India Company from the Netherlands, they set up trade and they monopolized this trade and said they were the only people that could trade to India now and to Asia, and they monopolized this trade. And in 1647, the ship called Harlem, they were en route to India and they were shipwrecked at Table Bay during a storm, and they uh, basically went back to, after their shipwreck the next year, they went back to Netherlands and told Netherlands, um, the people at the Dutch East India Company, that at the Cape there was plenty of water, there was fertile soil, and there were lots of wild animals, and it would be a great halfway stop to recuperate. Now, there were two reasons why they set up a place at Table Bay. Now, in 1647, this ship that was shipwrecked at Table Bay, their sailors survived and they lived in Cape Table Bay for 1 year. And they got fresh water from the rivers. They grew vegetables with the help of the Khoi people. So the first reason was that Table Bay was a suitable place for a settlement, and the purpose of this settlement was to provide the VOC ships with water and fresh supplies, and the sailors could go onto land and stretch their legs and get comfortable. Because you know that the trade sailing all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe was quite tiring, and then to go across the Indian Ocean to Asia was another journey. So they needed this halfway stop. And while they were traveling, the sailors, they got a disease called scurvy, and this was caused to a lack of vitamin C, and the VOC decided that it was a good idea to set up the halfway station at the Cape so that they would get lots of fruit and vegetables and they won't be so sickly. You could see there how scurvy looked on his hand. Right, so the results was basically when they arrived at Table Bay in 1652, Jan van Riebeeck came with his lovely wife, Maria de la Quere, and he came with about 100 people, and these people were soldiers, sailors, and other skilled workers. And the VOC gave Jan van Riebeeck specific instructions and told him to plant vegetable seeds and small fruit trees, and also to set up peaceful, friendly trade with the Khoi people. So Jan van Riebeeck, he was instructed to build a fort for their protection and also to build a hospital for the sick sailors from the VOC ships. Now, the original fort was built out of mud clay and timber, and this did not exist anymore because it was washed away during a storm. So a more permanent brick structure was erected with sandstone and cement, and it is called the castle, and it is still in existence in Cape Town today, and that's how it looks. So why were slaves brought to the Cape? Now the VOC realized that they could not produce enough food for the passing ships all on their own, and they needed people to set up their own farms. So they brought boeres, that is a Dutch word which is called a farmer in English, and they brought them from Holland and told them to come to settle in the Cape. Now, in the early 1700s, about 1,000 Dutch settlers came to live in Cape, and they built houses, shops, taverns, offices, and a whole new town emerged. And these people were carpenters, bricklayers, innkeepers, bankers, officials, and blacksmiths. And they also went into farming outside of the town, and they produced food, and their settlement was growing, and they needed more land, and they moved inland to do farming. So this situation caused conflict with the indigenous people, which was a local Khoikhoi people, and these Khoikhoi people were successful herders, and they had no interest in helping people that wanted to take their land away from them, and they did not want to grow crops either, so they did not want to do any building for the Dutch. So Van Riebeeck said that he was going to get slaves because he was not allowed to enslave the local people. The Dutch strictly gave him instructions to not enslave any indigenous people. So when he worked for the VOC in the East Indies, he realized that they used to use slaves, and this gave him the idea of bringing slaves in to do all the hard work. And this is basically how the process of colonization started in the Cape, and it moved to Natal as well. So where did all these slaves came from? They came from Angola, they came from places along the Indian Ocean like Mozambique, Madagascar, Japan, New Guinea, Angola. And all these people, they were talented and skillful people, and they were forced to leave their own homes and their family and their friends. And they had to learn Dutch. And what had happened was that these slaves, they took a mixture of Dutch, they took their own Malay language and a little bit of English, and they formed the Afrikaans language. So if you look at the map, these are all the places that the slaves came from. Now, in the early years of the slavery, the Dutch East Indian Company, they owned their own slaves, and they housed them in a slave lodge in Adderley Street in Cape Town. Now, this was the second oldest building in Cape Town, and it is now a museum. And if you look at the picture on the top, this is how it looks currently. And in 1658, there were only 11 slaves in Cape, and it grew so much with the expansion of all the farms that they built. So people became slaves, one, because they were sold, they sold themselves into slavery. Their families sold them because their families were very poor and they wanted money. They could not afford to pay their debt, so they basically enslaved themselves. Their parents were slaves, so they became slaves as well. And most of the people were captured during war. Um, and a lot of money was made from the slave trade. So people started wars themselves just so that they could get slaves. And how were they brought into slaves? They were brought via ship, via the VOC brought them. And they brought skilled craftsmen and domestic workers, and many of these people were Muslims. Now, the slave ships from Britain, France, and Portugal also brought slaves from Mozambique and other places in Africa, and they sold them in the Cape. And between 1654 and 1786, the VOC organized 33 journeys to Madagascar just to bring slaves. So what was it like to be a slave? One, now imagine that you were a slave in Cape Town and you didn't know anyone there. You could not speak the language. You were given a new name. You had lost your identity because you were not allowed to use your own name. You had nothing of your own except the clothing on your back. You were not even allowed to wear shoes. You were all alone. You were not allowed to speak to your family. You were not allowed to go home ever again, and this was your new life, working day and night as a slave. And what made it really cruel was that the owner was very cruel themselves. Now, most of the slaves worked on farms outside of Cape Town for long hours, and farm work was very hard. Some of the slaves belonged to the VOC and they lived at the slave lodge. And when this building was washed away, they started to build a castle in 1666 to replace the Fort Mud, and here they grew vegetables in their gardens. Now, these slaves belonged to rich people. They worked as domestic workers in their houses, and they were skilled and they earned some money from their owners because not all the owners were cruel, and they became tailors, furniture makers, and house plasterers. So this is the pictures of how the slaves used to work and how they were kept. Right, the causes and effects of slave resistance. The slaves' owners controlled their slaves very strictly, and they whipped them, and they chained them, and they starved them. And you know about all of this because you did it in last term in the transatlantic slave trade. So the slaves tried to run away, and they were put in chains, and they were punished cruelly, and they had to follow very strict rules. And some of these rules were they had to be indoors before 10 p.m. They could not carry and walk around in the streets after 10. They could not ride on wagons. They were not allowed to gather on the street and talk to their friends. So this has basically made their lives very difficult, and they were not allowed to lead um, their own lives. So the Dutch East India Company auctioned these slaves, and they brought them, and they used advertisements in newspapers to sell them. So these slaves were miserable, and they decided to rebel, and they organized two uprisings in the 1800s when they were under the British rule. And in 1834, after these uprisings and rebellions, their slavery diminished and it was abolished, and their freedom started. Now, I don't have time because um, uh, I'm only allowed a certain amount of minutes. So what you can do on your own is to go through these two case studies and you can answer these questions. But hope you enjoyed this lesson. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in my next video. Bye everyone.